What happens when a Hollywood actor known for his quiet intensity walks onto a daytime talk show famous for its sharp questions, and instead of answering, he chooses silence? The studio lights glowed brighter than usual that morning. The set felt polished, cheerful, almost too cheerful, like the calm before a sudden storm. The audience had come expecting a typical celebrity interview. Some laughs, a few stories from the latest movie, maybe a playful debate between the hosts. Nothing out of the ordinary. But something about the moment Christian Bale stepped onto the stage felt different. He walked in with that familiar, composed presence, the kind that had made him unforgettable in so many roles. Polite smile, calm eyes, a small wave to the cheering crowd. The applause rolled through the studio, like a wave crashing against the stage. Sunny Hostin greeted him with a bright smile, leaning forward slightly as she shook his hand. Christian, welcome. It's great to have you here. Thank you for having me, Bale replied softly, his voice measured and calm. The audience clapped again. Cameras zoomed in. Everything looked normal. But beneath the polished smiles and rehearsed introductions, there was an undercurrent no one in the audience could quite explain yet. The hosts exchanged quick glances, the kind viewers might miss at home, but that spoke volumes in person. Sunny began the conversation with the easy rhythm of a seasoned interviewer. So, Christian, you've had an incredible career. Every role you take seems to transform you completely. Your latest film is already generating a lot of buzz. Bale nodded politely. It was an interesting experience, he said. His answers were short, controlled, careful, the kind of answers that made producers behind the cameras lean forward just a little closer. Sunny continued. You're known for disappearing into your roles. Physically, emotionally, sometimes even mentally preparing for months. How do you leave that behind when filming ends? Bale gave a faint smile. You don't always leave it behind. A soft murmur moved through the audience. It was an intriguing answer, but still safe. Still professional. The interview continued for a few minutes, like this. Film talk. Acting techniques. Stories from set. Light laughter from the audience. But then Sunny leaned forward slightly, and the atmosphere shifted. Well, she said, her tone thoughtful, your career hasn't always been without controversy. There have been moments when people questioned your intensity, your temper on set. The audience went quiet, not completely silent, but quieter. The kind of quiet that spreads when people realize something unscripted might be about to happen. Christian Bale didn't immediately respond. Instead, he sat back in his chair. Still, the cameras zoomed closer. Sunny continued gently, though there was unmistakable curiosity in her voice. Many actors say passion is necessary for great art, but some critics have suggested your dedication crosses a line sometimes. How do you respond to that? Another pause. A longer one this time. Bale's expression didn't change, but he didn't answer. 5 seconds passed. 10 seconds. In television time, that's an eternity. The audience began shifting in their seats. One of the other hosts attempted a quick smile, as if preparing to jump in and lighten the mood. But Sunny kept her eyes on Bale, waiting. Finally, Bale leaned forward slightly. He looked at Sunny, then at the audience. And instead of speaking, he said nothing. Just silence. Not awkward silence. Not confused silence. But deliberate silence. The kind that makes people lean forward because they know something meaningful is happening, even if they can't quite explain it yet. Sunny blinked once, clearly not expecting that response. Well, she said with a small laugh, that's one way to answer. The audience chuckled nervously, but Bale still hadn't spoken. His gaze stayed steady, thoughtful, almost challenging. The moment stretched. Somewhere backstage, producers were whispering rapidly through headsets. Is this planned? Did we miss something? Why isn't he answering? On the stage, Sunny shifted slightly in her seat. So, is that your answer? She asked carefully. Bale finally spoke. Quietly. Sometimes, he said, people already believe the story they want to believe. His voice was calm, but there was something behind it, something heavy. As Sunny tilted her head. And you're saying those stories aren't true? Bale didn't reply immediately. Again, silence. The audience now sat completely still. This wasn't a normal interview anymore. it had turned into something else. Something unpredictable. And no one knew where it was going next. Before we go further, make sure you subscribe to Live Narratives for more dramatic and explosive celebrity moments like this. If you enjoy intense behind-the-scenes stories and unexpected confrontations, hit the like button and drop a comment below about what you think is about to happen here, because this conversation is only just beginning. Back on the stage, Sunny seemed determined to understand what was happening. "Christian," she said gently, "I think our viewers would appreciate clarity." Bale nodded slightly, but his next words only deepened the mystery. "Clarity," he said slowly, "depends on who's asking the question." A ripple of whispers moved through the audience. Sunny's expression sharpened. It wasn't hostility, but it was the unmistakable look of a host realizing the conversation had entered dangerous territory. "And what do you mean by that?" Bale leaned back again. His eyes drifted briefly toward the audience, then back to Sunny. The silence returned. Longer. He exhaled softly. "You invited me here to talk about my work," he said calmly. Sunny nodded. "Yes, of course. But sometimes," Bale continued, "the conversation becomes about something else." The tension in the room became almost physical. The other hosts shifted uncomfortably. Producers backstage exchanged worried looks. And the audience realized they were witnessing something rare on live television, an interview slowly turning into a quiet standoff. Sunny folded her hands on the table. Still composed. Still professional. But her voice carried a sharper edge now. "Are you saying we're being unfair?" Bale met her gaze. And for the first time since he had walked onto the stage, there was unmistakable intensity in his eyes. "I'm saying," he replied softly, "sometimes silence says more than defending yourself ever could." The audience gasped lightly. Not loudly, but enough that the tension snapped like a thread pulled too tight. Sunny didn't smile this time. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Two strong personalities. Two different worlds. Locked in a quiet battle of words and silence. And what happened next would turn this calm daytime interview into one of the most talked-about television moments of the year. Because Sunny Hostin wasn't about to let that silence win. The studio air felt heavier now, as if the bright lights above the stage had suddenly grown hotter. The audience could sense it. This was no longer the comfortable rhythm of a celebrity interview. Something had shifted, and everyone in the room felt it. Across the table, Christian Bale sat with the same calm posture he had walked in with, but the silence he had created still lingered in the space between him and Sunny Hostin like an invisible wall. Sunny leaned slightly forward again, her voice still professional, but her curiosity now mixed with determination. "Well," she said slowly, "I don't think anyone here is trying to create a story about you. We're simply asking questions viewers are already wondering about." A few members of the audience nodded. That was the thing about The View. The hosts didn't usually back away from uncomfortable conversations. Christian Bale looked at her for a long moment. Then he gave a small, almost amused smile. "But the way questions are asked," he said quietly, "can shape the story just as much as the answers." The room went quiet again. Sunny tilted her head slightly. "So, you think we're shaping a narrative?" Bale didn't answer right away. His fingers rested loosely on the table, relaxed, almost casual. But his eyes were sharp. "I think," he said finally, "that people often prefer drama to truth." A small ripple of murmurs moved through the crowd. Sunny sat back for a moment, clearly considering her next move. She had interviewed politicians, celebrities, public figures of every kind. Confrontation didn't scare her. But this was different. Because Bale wasn't raising his voice. He wasn't arguing. He was simply refusing to play the expected role. One of the other hosts jumped in, trying to ease the growing tension. "Well, Christian," she said with a light laugh, "Hollywood is definitely full of drama. That's why audiences love it." A few people in the crowd chuckled, but Bale's expression didn't change much. "Drama belongs on screen," he replied calmly. Sunny's eyes narrowed just slightly, not in anger, but in focus. "Are you suggesting we're turning this interview into entertainment at your expense?" The question hung in the air. The cameras zoomed in again, and for a brief moment, Bale's calm mask slipped just enough for the audience to glimpse something deeper: fatigue. Not anger. Not arrogance. Just the exhaustion of someone who had answered the same questions for years. You ever notice, he said quietly, how people talk about an actor's worst moment more than their best work? Sunny didn't immediately respond. Because he wasn't wrong. The audience had gone completely silent now, every person leaning forward slightly in their seats. Bale continued. 20 years of films. Dozens of performances. Thousands of hours of work. He paused. And one moment becomes the headline. The reference was obvious to anyone who followed Hollywood. Years earlier, a leaked recording from a film set had captured Bale angrily confronting a crew member who disrupted a scene. The clip had spread across the internet instantly, becoming one of the most infamous behind-the-scenes moments in film history. Sunny nodded slowly. Yes, she admitted. That moment did receive a lot of attention. Exactly, Bale said softly. His tone wasn't offensive. It was reflective. People rarely ask what happened before that moment, or what happened after. Sunny folded her hands together again. Well, she said carefully, that's actually a fair point. But when someone is a public figure, those moments become part of their story. Bale looked out toward the audience. And who decides which moments define a person? The question landed heavily. The studio felt quieter than ever. Somewhere behind the cameras, a producer whispered urgently into a headset. This interview was no longer following the outline they had prepared. Sunny leaned forward again. You're saying the media gets it wrong. Bale gave a small shrug. I'm saying people are complicated. A few people in the audience nodded again. The tension in the room shifted slightly, not disappearing, but changing shape. For a moment, the conversation felt almost philosophical. But Sunny wasn't finished. Let me ask you something honestly, she said. Bale met her gaze. When that recording happened, when the world heard you yelling on that set, did you regret it? The question was direct, blunt. Exactly the kind of question that could reignite the tension. The audience held its breath. Bale didn't answer immediately. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table. His voice, when it came, was quieter than before. Of course I regretted it. The honesty in the answer caught everyone off guard. Sunny blinked, surprised by how quickly he admitted it. But, Bale continued, regret doesn't erase a moment. He glanced toward the audience again. And it doesn't stop people from replaying it forever. The studio fell silent once more. Sunny nodded slowly. I understand that, she said. Then she added, carefully but firmly. But at the same time, people watching at home might wonder, if someone can react that intensely in private, what does that say about who they are? The moment she finished speaking, a ripple moved through the audience. It wasn't loud, but it carried a certain energy, because everyone understood what she was really asking. Was that moment the real Christian Bale? Or just a rare mistake caught on tape? Bale stared at the table for a moment. Then he looked up again. His expression had changed. The calm was still there. But now there was something else too. Resolve. You want the honest answer? He asked. Sunny nodded. Yes. Bale inhaled slowly. And when he spoke again, his words carried a weight that instantly shifted the entire atmosphere of the room. The honest answer, he said, is that moment wasn't the worst thing I've ever done. The audience gasped softly. Sunny's eyes widened. Because that wasn't the direction anyone expected him to go. And whatever he was about to reveal next was about to make this interview even more explosive. The moment the words left his mouth, the entire studio seemed to freeze. A quiet gasp rippled through the audience as they processed what Christian Bale had just said. The honest answer is that moment wasn't the worst thing I've ever done. For a split second, even Sunny Hostin looked genuinely stunned. Not because the statement sounded scandalous, but because of how calmly he had said it. There was no drama in his voice. No attempt to shock anyone. Just honesty. And that made it far more powerful. Sunny leaned slightly forward, clearly trying to understand where he was going with this. Well, that's a very candid statement, she said carefully. What do you mean by that? Bale rested his hands together on the table, his posture relaxed but thoughtful. I mean, he said slowly, everyone has moments they regret. Moments they wish the world never saw. He looked briefly toward the audience. And moments the world never will see. The audience stayed silent, completely drawn into the conversation now. Sunny nodded, but she wasn't going to let the statement pass without clarity. So, are you saying that people judged you too harshly for that incident? Bale tilted his head slightly. I'm saying people judged one moment, he replied, without knowing the person behind it. There was something reflective in his tone now. Less confrontational. More philosophical. Sunny studied him for a moment. Then she asked the question many people watching at home were probably thinking. But isn't that part of being a public figure? Bale didn't answer immediately. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, glancing up briefly at the studio lights before returning his gaze to the table. When I was younger, he said quietly, I thought acting was about becoming someone else. He paused. But over time, I realized something. The audience leaned forward slightly. Sunny watched him closely. What's that? She asked. That the world will still try to decide who you are anyway. The line landed heavily in the room. The audience murmured softly. It wasn't offensive. It wasn't bitter. It sounded like experience. Sunny exhaled lightly and nodded. I think a lot of people can relate to that, she admitted. For the first time since the tension began, the tone of the conversation softened. But then Sunny added another question. And yet, people also admire you because of that intensity. Your dedication to roles is legendary. She smiled slightly. You've transformed your body, your voice, even your personality for films. A few audience members applauded lightly. Bale gave a modest shrug. That's just part of the job. Sunny raised an eyebrow playfully. Most actors don't starve themselves or gain massive weight for roles. The crowd laughed. Even Bale cracked a small smile. Fair point, he said. The atmosphere relaxed for a moment. But Sunny wasn't finished. And that intensity, that commitment, do you ever worry that it costs you something personally? The question lingered in the air. Bale's smile faded slightly. He considered the question carefully. Then he nodded once. Yes. The answer was simple. Honest. Sunny seemed surprised again. You do. Bale looked down briefly before answering. When you spend months becoming someone else, he said quietly, sometimes it takes time to remember who you are again. The audience murmured softly. It was the first time during the interview that Bale sounded vulnerable. Sunny leaned forward. That must be difficult. Bale shrugged lightly. It's part of the craft. But Sunny sensed there was more behind the statement. So, how do you balance that with real life? Family, relationships, just being yourself. Bale chuckled quietly. I'm still figuring that out. The audience laughed gently with him. The tension that had filled the room earlier now felt more complex, less like a confrontation and more like a rare glimpse behind the curtain of fame. Sunny smiled slightly. Well, I appreciate the honesty. But then she asked something that once again shifted the mood. Let me ask you something different. Bale looked up. Sunny's tone changed just enough to signal a deeper question. You've played heroes, villains, complicated characters. She leaned forward. But if someone asked you who the real Christian Bale is, what would you say? The audience grew quiet again. Bale blinked slowly. For the first time since the interview began, he didn't seem to have an immediate answer. He looked toward the audience, then back at Sunny, then down at his hands. A long pause followed. The silence stretched so long that a few people in the crowd shifted in their seats. Sunny didn't interrupt. She simply waited. Finally, Bale inhaled slowly. And when he spoke, his voice carried a weight that no script could have captured. The truth. Sunny nodded. Yes. Bale looked up again. The truth is, I don't think people really want to know the real version of someone. The audience murmured again. Sunny frowned slightly. Why would you say that? Bale met her eyes. Because the real version is messy. He leaned forward slightly. Flawed. Another pause. And far less entertaining. The words hung in the air. For the first time in the interview, Sunny didn't immediately respond. Because something about that statement had shifted the entire conversation. It wasn't about headlines anymore. It wasn't about controversy. It had become something deeper. But just as the moment seemed to settle, One of the other hosts at the table leaned in with a question that would push the conversation into even more uncomfortable territory. And the moment the words left her mouth, even the audience knew the interview was about to take another dramatic turn. The quiet reflection that had settled over the studio didn't last long. Just as the audience began to relax into the deeper tone of the conversation, one of the other hosts leaned forward slightly, curiosity written all over her face. The timing of her question was almost surgical. "Christian," she said, glancing briefly towards Sunny Hostin before turning back to him, "you said people don't really want to know the real version of someone because it's messy." Across the table, Christian Bale lifted his eyes again. "Yes," he replied calmly. The host tilted her head. "But isn't that exactly what audiences want now? Authenticity." A few audience members murmured in agreement. In the era of social media, fans constantly demanded celebrities to be real,
to show their true selves,
to drop the polished image. Bale gave a quiet, thoughtful smile. "That's what people say they want," he replied. The room fell silent again. Then he added softly, "But authenticity is uncomfortable." The words hung in the air. Sunny leaned forward again, intrigued. "Uncomfortable how?" Bale shifted slightly in his chair, his voice steady but reflective. "Because the real version of someone rarely fits the narrative people have already decided." The audience absorbed that slowly. Sunny folded her hands together. "So, you think people prefer the story to the truth?" Bale nodded slightly. "Stories are easier." There was something almost philosophical about the moment now. But Sunny's journalistic instincts pushed her further. "Let's talk about that narrative for a second," she said carefully. The audience felt the tension creeping back. "You've been described in many ways over the years," she continued. "Brilliant, intense, difficult, even intimidating on set." Bale didn't react outwardly, but he was listening closely. Sunny's voice remained calm but direct. "Do you think any of those descriptions are fair?" Another pause. The audience leaned forward again. Bale rested his hands together. "Some of them probably are," he admitted. The honesty drew a ripple of whispers. Sunny blinked slightly, surprised again by his willingness to acknowledge it. "So, you admit you can be difficult?" Bale chuckled softly. "I think anyone deeply invested in their work can be difficult." A few audience members laughed, but Sunny followed quickly. "Some people would say that's just an excuse." The tension snapped back into place. The audience went quiet. Bale didn't raise his voice. He didn't look offended, but his expression sharpened just enough to signal that the conversation had reached another crossroads. "Or," he said calmly, "it could be honesty." Sunny met his gaze. "But what about the people who have worked with you and felt intimidated?" The question landed harder than the previous ones, because now it wasn't about headlines. It was about people. Bale leaned back slightly, exhaling slowly before answering. "Film sets are high-pressure environments," he said. "Hundreds of people working toward the same moment." He paused briefly. "And when something threatens that moment, emotions can run high." Sunny nodded. "But not everyone reacts the same way." "That's true," Bale replied. The audience waited for more. But Bale stopped there. The silence returned again. That silence. The same silence that had started everything earlier. Sunny noticed it too. "You do that a lot," she said suddenly. Bale raised an eyebrow.
"What?"
"You pause," she explained. "You leave space where people expect an explanation." The audience chuckled lightly. But Sunny wasn't joking. She leaned closer. "Is that intentional?" Bale smiled faintly. "Yes." The simple answer made the crowd laugh again. But Sunny pressed further. "Why?" Bale looked around the studio, at the cameras, at the audience, then back at the table. "Because people rush to fill silence," he said quietly. He tapped the table lightly. "And when they do, they reveal what they're really thinking." The room went still. Sunny stared at him for a moment. Then she smiled slowly. "So you're saying you've been studying us this whole time?" The audience laughed louder now. Bale shrugged playfully. "I'm an actor." The tension softened slightly again. But Sunny wasn't finished yet. "There's something interesting about this conversation," she said thoughtfully. Bale waited. Sunny continued. "You came here to promote a film. A few audience members laughed softly at the obvious truth. And yet somehow, she said, we've spent most of the interview talking about perception, reputation, identity. Bale nodded once. That tends to happen. Sunny tilted her head. But maybe that's because people are fascinated by you. The audience murmured. Sunny continued. You're private. You rarely do interviews. And when you do, you're unpredictable. Bale smiled faintly. Unpredictable sounds better than boring. The audience laughed again. But Sunny suddenly asked one last question. And the tone of her voice changed just enough for everyone to feel it. Christian, she said slowly, do you ever feel misunderstood? The room fell silent again. Bale didn't answer right away. He looked toward the audience, then toward the cameras, then back at Sunny. The pause lasted nearly 10 seconds. And when he finally spoke, his answer was so simple that it sent a quiet wave through the entire studio.
No.
Sunny blinked. No. Bale shook his head slightly.
No.
The audience shifted, confused. Sunny leaned forward. If you don't feel misunderstood, then why defend yourself at all? The question echoed in the room. Bale looked at her calmly. And then he delivered the line that would later explode across social media, news headlines, and late-night television clips around the world. I'm not defending myself. The audience leaned in. Bale's voice dropped slightly. I'm just letting people show who they are when they interpret my silence. A stunned hush fell over the studio. Even Sunny didn't immediately respond, because suddenly the entire interview felt different. Every question, every pause, every moment of silence. It all meant something else now. And what happened in the final minutes of the interview would turn this quiet conversation into one of the most talked about moments ever to come out of The View. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything that had come before. For a moment, no one in the studio moved. Not the audience, not the hosts, not even the production crew behind the cameras. Christian Bale sat calmly in his chair, his hands resting lightly on the table as if he had simply finished an ordinary sentence. But the words he had just spoken still echoed in the room. I'm not defending myself. I'm just letting people show who they are when they interpret my silence. Across from him, Sunny Hostin looked at him carefully, her expression thoughtful rather than confrontational now. The tension between them had changed shape again, not a clash anymore, but something closer to mutual recognition. Sunny leaned back slowly. Well, she said softly, that's quite a perspective. A few nervous chuckles came from the audience, but the room remained mostly quiet, because everyone sensed the interview had reached its emotional peak. Sunny glanced briefly toward the other hosts, then back at Bale. You know, she continued, I think viewers at home might hear that statement in two very different ways. Bale tilted his head slightly. How so? Sunny folded her hands together again. Some might hear wisdom in it, she said. The idea that silence can reveal more than arguments.
She paused.
But others might hear it as avoidance. The audience murmured softly. It was the final challenge of the interview. Not aggressive,
but direct.
Bale nodded slowly, as if he had expected that question all along. That's the interesting thing about silence, he replied quietly. Sunny waited. Bale's voice remained calm. It becomes a mirror. The audience leaned forward. People see in it whatever they already believe. The words hung in the air. Sunny considered them for a moment, then gave a small, thoughtful smile. That's a very actor's answer. The audience laughed lightly, breaking the tension. Bale chuckled too. Probably. The atmosphere finally began to soften. The storm that had slowly built over the course of the interview was now drifting away, leaving behind something quieter, reflection. Sunny glanced down briefly at her notes, then looked back up. Well, Christian, before we let you go, we should probably talk about the reason you came here today. The audience laughed again. Bale smiled. Ah, yes. The film. Sunny nodded. Yes, the film. The lightness returned to the room as they spent the next few minutes discussing Bale's latest project, his preparation for the role, the story behind the film, and the creative process that went into bringing the character to life. But even as the conversation returned to safer ground, the earlier tension still lingered in the minds of everyone watching. Because this had been no ordinary celebrity interview. It had become something else entirely. A quiet psychological chess match. And when the segment finally ended, the audience erupted into applause. Not the casual applause of a daytime show, but the kind people give when they know they've witnessed something unusual. Sunny stood and extended her hand again. "Christian Bale, everyone." The crowd cheered. Bale shook her hand, then nodded politely to the other hosts before walking off stage. But the story didn't end there. Because within minutes of the broadcast ending, clips from the interview began spreading across social media like wildfire. Short videos of Bale's quiet pauses, his calm responses, and especially that line, "I'm just letting people show who they are when they interpret my silence." On platforms across the internet, viewers began debating what it meant. Some praised Bale's composure, calling the moment masterful, saying he had turned a potentially hostile interview into a philosophical conversation. Others argued that Sunny had asked fair questions and that Bale had simply avoided direct accountability. Clips of Sunny Hostin leaning forward with her questions were shared alongside clips of Bale's long silences. Headlines appeared within hours. Did Christian Bale outsmart the hosts? Awkward moment on The View goes viral. Christian Bale's silence sparks internet debate. Late-night comedians joked about it. Entertainment blogs dissected every second. Body language experts posted breakdown videos analyzing Bale's posture, Sunny's tone, even the audience reactions. Some viewers called it brilliant. Others called it uncomfortable. But almost everyone agreed on one thing. They couldn't stop talking about it. And maybe that was the most fascinating part of all. Because the moment that everyone remembered most from the interview wasn't a shout, wasn't an argument, wasn't a dramatic walk-off. It was silence. The kind of silence that forces people to think, forcing them to fill the space with their own assumptions, their own opinions, their own beliefs. And in that silence, the audience had become part of the story. Now we want to hear from you. What did you think about this intense moment between Christian Bale and Sunny Hostin? Was Bale making a powerful point about perception and media narratives? Or do you think the hosts were simply doing their job by asking tough questions? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We read them all and feature some of the best ones in future videos. And if you enjoy dramatic celebrity moments, intense interviews, and stories that reveal what really happens behind the cameras, make sure you subscribe to Live Narratives. Because the next story might be even more explosive.
Clapperboard.